Well, it looks like people are beginning to hop on. So thank you everyone for joining us for this month's Ranching 101. We're excited to be joined today by professors from the Texas Tech Vet School, and they have a great presentation lined up for you all. But before we do that, I wanted to share a brief video from our sponsors. We cannot thank Lone Star Ag Credit enough for their support and all they do for TSCRA. So without further ado, here's a brief video.
My name's Tony Ballinger, and me and my family own and operate Crossbeat Cattle Company. We'd be considered a first-generation ranching operation. You know, we kind of started from scratch and kind of built up over the years. Just me and my son, Carson. You know, the guys there at Lone Star, they do a good job of building a good relationship. It's more like dealing with a partner than it is a bike. And I think that's really important in the ag business.
So once again, thank you to Lone Star Ag Credit for their support. If you are interested in joining us next month for Ranching 101, it's going to be Great Sale, Good Day, and it's going to be a moderated discussion on best practices for selling cattle and etiquette at the sale barn. That will be August 16th at 1 p.m. on Zoom again. And our registration for Policy Conference has opened. So if you're interested in joining us, we will be in San Antonio, September 12th through the 14th. And you can find all of that information on tscra.org. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to these ladies. And if you have any questions throughout the PowerPoint, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. And I'll be sure to drop my email if you have questions after the webinar. So thank y'all for joining us.
That look okay to everyone? Perfect. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. So I'm Dr. Jennifer Kojal. My colleague, Dr. Pippa Gibbons, is there at the bottom of your screen. And so we're super excited to join you all today. We're both associate professors of food animal medicine and surgery at Texas Tech Veterinary School here in Amarillo. So just to kind of get a idea of our audience today, we're hoping that you all will give us some feedback. So if you'll jump on your computers or on your phone and go to slido.com, and once you get the Slido, it'll say participate, and it will ask you for a code, and it's in the blue or green box at the top of your screen. And so I see some people are already answering, so we'll answer that first question. So you just put in TSCRA 2022. We'll let that answer. So give some background where we're letting people answer and get on Slido. So I'm originally from Oklahoma, grew up on a cow-calf operation and stocker operation in Oklahoma. Dr. Gibbons grew up in England. So we were fortunate enough to get to visit her family home just recently. So that was very exciting. So she grew up on a cow-calf and farming operation in England. So we're both really familiar with the cattle industry, grew up in the cattle industries. And so we're excited to talk to you all today. So having some votes. Wait a few more minutes and we'll switch questions because we have 2 questions. So I can see the results, Pippa can't. So right now we have, for the first question, do you have a valid VCPR? We have 79% say no, 20% say yes. Still have some votes coming in.
It looks like you have a question asking, what does VCPR stand for?
A valid client-patient relationship. That's a great question. So I'm going to go to this slide.
And while you're filling that out, I don't think we covered this in our talk, but what a VCPR means is that you have a relationship with a veterinarian, and that typically, there are some practice differences, typically means that they have seen your operation and have enough knowledge of your cattle operation that they can prescribe you drugs and make recommendations for your herd. So and you can have a VCPR with more than one veterinarian potentially. You'll also hear the term veterinarian of record. And that's not something we're going to go into today too much either, but VCPR is, they have to be familiar with your herd within the past year.
All right. So it looks like we're about 50-50 yes and no on that question. So I'm going to stop that one and I'm going to activate the next one. So if you can, who has an active written herd health management plan with your veterinarian? So we're getting great participation. So I think today's talk is going to be really exciting for Pippa and I. Looks like we have about 86% no and 14% yes. So hopefully Dr. Gibbons and I can give you some great information about what goes into a written herd health management plan and how you can start building those with your veterinarian. So it looks like we're about all done with our poll, so we'll get started. So we'll go to the next slide.
Okay. So I'm going to, this looks like a really busy slide, but this is kind of an introduction to kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So what is an active herd management plan? And it's typically a written document. And it incorporates many different things. It incorporates best management practices. It incorporates potentially treatment protocols. And this is really important if you are remote from your local veterinarian, so that they have given you protocols so you know how to treat various common conditions. And it can also be a place to keep records, so disease records, production records, cows calved, etc., like that, and give you targets. So you know that we had a bad year, it's on paper, this is a target that I want to, I should call my veterinarian, I should set up something that we've got something going on here before it gets too late and too far down the road. But this is something, and there's no dates on here. And so for beginner cattle producers, I like to put one of these together and then for each particular farm, put the dates that apply to that. And I can't put dates on here because everybody likes to start calving season differently. Some keep the bull in all year, some have a fall and spring calving season. But usually we're going to start kind of our year with calving season. So that's right at the top there. So calving season starts. The next thing we want to be thinking about is castration of our bull calves. And if we have horned cattle, dehorning those calves, and calf vaccination. And we'll talk more about what goes into each of those things. But these are our protocols that would be written in your herd plan, that this is how we're going to castrate, this is how we're going to dehorn, this is what we're going to use for vaccinations. Then hopefully we have a calving season, and Dr. Kojal will talk a bunch about why we should have a calving season, but it makes it very nice and easy. Once our calving season ends, we actually want to start thinking about starting the year over, and we're going to start breeding those cows back. So they're all calving once a year. So before we get there, we've got to think about, we've got to choose our bulls. And then once we've chosen our bulls, we want to make sure that they're fertile. So we're going to do a breeding soundness exam on them. Depending on whether we run bulls with the cattle or whether we do AI and have cleanup bulls, we've got to think back on what would be our synchronization protocol if we're doing AI, when we would put that bull in. So it would all work backwards, so we're not kind of trying to catch ourselves up all the time. We're going to wean the calves, and we're going to talk about weaning protocols. We're going to talk about whether we should vaccinate them, depending on your vaccine program. So it will all be laid out, or should all be laid out for you as to this is when we vaccinate the cows, this is when we vaccinate the calves, this is what we're going to use it with, this is how we're going to administer it. So we put the bulls in, we're going to take them out so that it corresponds to having a nice calving season. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to think about pregnancy detection. This is a point where we're also going to talk about cow culling. So you can think about having in your plan as to what your replacement rate is going to be and which cows you were going to cull. And then all these kind of gray square things are times that it's really good to monitor the body condition score of cattle. So we'll talk a little bit today about nutrition. Obviously, you can talk for hours on beef cattle nutrition alone. But these are really key times that you're going to get your cattle in most typically. And so you are going to assess their body condition. And that's probably the easiest basic way to assess nutrition of your cow-calf operation. Other things that will go in there depending on when the fly season is. And I said fly tags, but it really should say fly control because it's obviously a major thing that we want to think about in our cow-calf operation. Deworming, again, depends on how you run your cattle, when that will fit in the cycle. And then along with that, and this is something that your veterinarian might be able to help you with, or your extension agent or nutritionist, grazing specialist, will be how to manage the grazing management and forages within that plan. So everybody, the extension agent, the nutritionist, and the veterinarian kind of knows and understands your operation. So they can all work together to help you be the most successful. Next. So these are just a couple of other key points. I think I talked about a lot of these, but the other one is that this is a living document. So this is not something that you pay your veterinarian to put together back in 2018 and it's going to stay the same because things change, because you might want to improve how you manage, or you might work together with your veterinarian to figure out your goals. And doing really huge goals at this time might be not something that you can do. So you can have small goals, and as you meet those small goals, then you can start working on bigger goals for your production system. So ideally, looking at every year, they can look at your records that you're keeping within that, looking how you're meeting targets in terms of production. And then this also constitutes that VCPR most typically. So once they've signed this, they know you're heard, you are good to go with that VCPR. Next.
All right, so we'll start off. So beef quality assurance is something that we feel very strongly about as veterinarians. And the great thing about beef quality assurance is that we as ranchers, our goal is to provide a safe, wholesome source of food. And so beef quality assurance is a great way to make sure that we as ranchers and as veterinarians are helping with providing that safe source. So it is a free resource that you can get. You go through different certifications. We can do low stress handling, medication administration, vaccine handling, biosecurity, tons and tons of free modules that you can do. And they're really great to explore and make sure that you are up to date with. So first thing we're going to talk about is reproduction. So I like to say that there's no production without reproduction. So it is a major area of emphasis for maintaining profitability and efficacy of your cattle herd. And it's great times to interact with your veterinarian. So I always say if you have the perfect year, you really only have to interact with your veterinarian a couple times a year. And this really maintains your veterinary client-patient relationship. So you should see your veterinarian at minimum twice a year when you do pregnancy checks and bull breeding soundness exams. These are great times to talk about where your herd is going, what medication protocols you're going to use, what your benchmarks are, and then go from there. We're going to talk about females, we'll talk about heifers and mature cows, and we'll talk about bulls as well. So bulls, so we'll just start with bulls. So just thinking about herd bull selection. When we go to herd bull selection, we want to think about what phenotype and genotype we're wanting. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be wide generalities. There's not two ranches that have the same goals. Everybody is a little bit different and unique. But things we really need to think about when we go to herd bull selection is, one, we need to pick a phenotype that's going to work well for that specific cow herd. And we need to think about the genotype of what we're getting. Do we need a low birth weight Cabanese bull because he is going to be breeding heifers? Are we looking for high weaning weights and yearling weights? Are we really concerned about carcass data? What is the areas that we want to really improve and grow on with this bull? Look closely at feet and legs, right? Just because his numbers are good, we need to make sure that he can go out and serve those cows, not only for his lifespan, but think about that he is going to pass on his conformation to calves, right? And so any replacement animals that you are going to keep, that's going to be, he's going to have a major influence on what their conformation looks like. Certainly need to, once we purchase a bull, when he gets to your operation, that bull needs to go into quarantine and be tested. We certainly want to test for bovine viral diarrhea virus if he hasn't already been tested, and trick. Trick is another disease that we need to test for as well if he hasn't been. Now, if that bull is in Texas, he should come with a negative trick test. That is part of our Texas law, but other states may not have as strict as trick regulations, but when we bring a bull into the state of Texas, he should have a negative trick test. So make sure if you buy a bull out of state and you're transferring home that you are meeting state regulations for that. Annual vaccines and parasite control for our bulls. They should really match the rest of our cow herd. That's the easiest thing to do with our bulls, is to match our vaccines and parasite control to the rest of our cow herd. If our cow herd gets vaccinated, our bulls get vaccinated. If our cows get dewormed, our bull gets dewormed. So we do that. Appropriate nutrition is vital. So our bulls, I really use this analogy quite a bit, but our bulls we want them at their peak performance. So we need to think about them as athletes, right? And so what do great athletes have? They have a balanced diet. They're kept in good physical condition. And we really want to focus on keeping our bulls there. Oftentimes bulls, when they come out of the breeding herd, when they're in the off season, they often get pushed away, forgotten about, but we really need to focus on making sure those bulls have adequate nutrition, that their health remains good all year long, to keep those bulls in peak condition all year long. Breeding soundness exams. So every bull, every year, and ideally before each breeding season, a bull should get a breeding soundness exam. Just because a bull has a breeding soundness exam once, but when he's sold as a yearling or a 2-year-old, does not mean that that is good for life. Bulls can change very drastically and very suddenly. So we talk about breeding soundness exams should occur 60 days prior to the breeding season. And so there's really nothing magic about that number other than you as a producer. If you have a bull that doesn't pass a breeding soundness exam, you as a producer have the opportunity and the time to go out and find a replacement bull, and you're not scrambling last second. So what does a complete breeding soundness exam entail? It really has what I can break down into 4 components. It's going to have a physical exam. We're going to look at the feet, legs, eyes, make sure that bull is able to go out and breed those cows. We're going to measure scrotal circumference. So we want a bull. So if a bull is 15 months or younger, they need to have a minimum of 30 centimeters scrotal circumference. If a bull is 2-year-old or older, it needs a minimum of 34 centimeters. So we're going to make sure that the scrotal circumference is adequate. It's highly correlated to puberty in its daughters, and it's also highly correlated to reproductive efficiency. And then we're going to collect semen from that bull, and we're going to look at motility and sperm morphology. So we're going to look at those under a microscope. So what does breeding soundness exams really do? So it's designed as a whole to identify subfertile bulls. And those subfertile bulls are what's really going to hurt reproductive efficiency in a herd. They're going to go out and breed cows, but those cows are not going to become pregnant. So remember, once your bull has passed a breeding soundness exam, we still need to make sure that that bull goes out and wants to breed cows and can successfully breed cows. So we need to make sure that he will complete the copulatory act. And trick testing. Trick testing is really important in the state of Texas, right? So if we look at data, we know in 2021, there was over 100 herds that had trick in the state of Texas. So this is something that we need to think about and that we need to be very cognizant of testing. Most of our bulls, once they're sold with negative trick tests for inter and intrastate movement requirements. But even once they're in a herd, we need to make sure that we test so we don't end up with a problem. Bulls versus AI. So it's hard to get away from not needing a bull in some capacity. However, with the use of artificial insemination, we can reduce the number of bulls needed within a herd. But when we are trying to decide if we're going to use natural service or AI, we need to make sure we match labor, resources, and goals of that herd. And we can make pros and cons lists from there. That certainly could be a whole talk that we don't have time to delve deep into, but it really kind of gives you some food for thought on that subject. So our females. So there's a question I'll just answer now. Does libido diminish with outdoor temperature? Absolutely, right? When it is 112 degrees outside right now, everybody wants to be underneath a shade tree and not out working, right? So we really need to think about that and what's going to happen as we get into our really hot months like July and August. So we can have bulls. Now, there are some bulls that will keep working even through the heat, but we do need to think about that the heat may affect the libido of the bull. And certainly also need to think about that testicles don't like to be hot. We are going to see some decrease in fertility with these record high heat in our bulls. Testicles like to be 3 to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than body temperature. Right now, a bull cannot maintain that. So yes, that is something we have to think about. Thank you for that question. So females, so going to our thinking, starting with our heifers. Heifer development is key when we think about our replacement heifers. So 65% of mature weight at the time of breeding needs to be our benchmark for thinking about those heifers. I would also, with a current landscape of where we are in the cattle markets and where we are with the drought, I'm really advocate for doing reproductive tract scoring and pelvic measurements in our heifers prior to the start of the breeding season. So reproductive tract scoring is going to be where a veterinarian goes in and scores the reproductive tract, finds the prepubertal females, and we can decide whether we're going to keep or cull depending on the number of heifers that we want. Pelvic measurement. So we're going to measure the area of the pelvis. This used to be really popular. It's kind of diminished and it's starting to pick up again. So what does pelvic measuring do for us? It really finds those heifers that have abnormally shaped pelvises that are going to be of concern later on. And it's going to find those heifers with abnormally small pelvises. It's not to say that we can breed a heifer to a bigger birth weight bull and not have any concerns. It's just there to find the abnormalities. So heifers should breed quickly. So I very much advocate for a very small calving, breeding and consequent calving window with our females. We need to make sure we maintain their nutrition and body condition scores throughout. Heifers really need to be in that body score of 5 to 6 at all times, making sure they're continuously gaining and hitting those benchmarks, weight benchmarks that we talk about. 65% at the time of breeding, 85% of their mature weight at the time of first calving. And we ideally want to breed our heifers to calve before our mature cows. So this allows our labor to be concentrated on those heifers because we know that the rate of dystocia is the highest in our first calf heifers. And it also allows those heifers a little more time as first calf heifers to regroup and be ready to be bred as second calf heifers, because that is the hardest time period in their life. They're nursing a cow, they're nursing a calf, they're growing as a cow, and they're trying to get rebred. So it really is the most difficult. So pregnancy checks. So palpation versus blood test. I think pregnancy tests by a veterinarian is a really great time to develop a veterinary client relationship. There's a value in maintaining that veterinary client relationship, and it gives you immediate results. You know, as soon as that veterinarian takes their arm out of that cow or heifer, what the status is. Are they pregnant? Are they open? And you can make immediate decisions. So immediate gratification in that. A veterinarian can determine gestation length. So if you're going to sort them, that is a great time to sort them. Are they early in the calving, going to be early in the calving season? They're going to be late in the calving season. If a cow is open, does she have a reason to be open? Is there something wrong with her reproductive tract? We can tell you that. And we can also look and say, if there's a problem with her pregnancy rates, we can develop a plan, right? Right then and there, we can sit down and say, we are below average. We are below our benchmarks. How are we going to address this, and what are our next steps? So moving on. So we've gotten through preg checks. We're moving into calving season. So thinking about our calving management. So know your plan for both your heifers and cows. So, and then making sure that you have appropriate supplies on hand. So just some great rules of thumb to have in your calving box. Make sure you have your obstetrical gloves, your obstetric chains, lube, lots of lube, your calf jack, if you're comfortable using one of those. Make sure you have colostrum replacer on hand, and then think about disease management. So thinking about as we go into calving and our neonatal care, we really want to decrease environmental contamination, because that's where our calves pick up the bacteria and viruses that cause scouring. So we can think about the sandhill calving system, where we continuously move groups of cows along the way to reduce contamination. If a cow or a heifer calves in a combined area, so for whatever reason they're not out on pasture, those are going to be great times to dip the navel with a dilute iodine and chlorhexidine. Your veterinarian can help get you set up for that. We really want to make sure that calf ingests enough colostrum. A calf needs 100 grams of IgG to be really set up for a thriving life as a calf. I can't stress how important colostrum intake is. There's tons of studies out there to show that a calf's life is really made or broke depending on colostrum intake and what their disease status is going to look like later on, and how well they will do. If a calf needs colostrum, like I said, 100 grams of IgG. And so you can look on bags of colostrum replacer, and it will say a minimum of 100 grams of IgG on it. And those are the ones that you really want to get. I always recommend having a couple of those. They have long expiration dates, so you can keep them in a cool, dry place and always have them on hand. So thinking about preventing dystocia, so we talked about that a little bit with our heifer selection processes. We talked a little bit about that with our bull selection. So we really want to match our bull selection and making sure we keep the right replacement heifers. Preparation for weather extremes. You all have known just as well as I do, we have run the gamut in the last few years of weather extremes. And I think we can probably say we're going to think about that for the next few years. But having the preparation, having a plan for weather extremes and what that looks like, right? I think the old adage, if you prepare for the worst and hope for the best, you're never disappointed. So thinking about that, planning on how, if we start calving in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of an ice storm, how we're going to get through that. So moving on to our weaning protocols. So choosing a weaning protocol that minimizes stress at weaning is really the way we want to go. And then we'll talk about this in the next few slides, but matching our weaning protocol and our vaccine protocols together to give us the best options for our cow herd. So we can do 2 types of weaning fence line, or we can do what we call two-stage weaning, where we put in anti-suckling rings. Those are 2 probably most popular type. Fence line weaning is probably a lot more common, what we see in Texas. We really want to minimize stress on these calves, because stress, we know anytime, it's just like us, right? With these calves, anytime there's high stress, the immune system decreases. So we want to keep that immune system robust, and we want to minimize stress. We want to move cows, not calves. We want to keep our calves at a home place that they're comfortable with. Consider our vaccine timelines. Are we going to do pre-weaning and then weaning vaccinations? Or are we going to do weaning and then post-weaning vaccinations? A time and a place for each. We just need to decide what fits our production scheme the best. We want to minimize high-risk calves in the feedlot. So anytime we're selling off calves, it's great to sell them as what we call preconditioned calves. So these are calves, they're going to be usually weaned approximately 45 days. They're going to be eating out of a feed bunk. They're going to be vaccinated. They're going to be dewormed. They're going to be castrated and dehorned. And so these are what we call preconditioned. Those really diminishes the amount of disease that we see later on in the feedlot. So nutrition. So highly encourage you. I will tell you that I love being a food animal veterinarian, but I am not a nutritionist. But we know a lot of great nutritionists, and I think we can work hand in hand. I talk about building a team a lot, and a nutritionist is a great person to put on your team along with your veterinarian. It could be a nutritionist, or it could be also your extension agent. Some of our extension agents are great nutritionists as well. We want to think about grazing management. How are we going to best utilize our grass? What forages can we add in? How can we extend or shorten our grazing seasons? What is our supplementary winter feeding going to look like? What is our hay? What are our protein levels? What is our energy in our hay? What are our hay levels looking like? Minerals. Know your deficiencies of your area. Even you may have multiple deficiencies within a ranch if it covers a big enough area. And then continuously monitor body condition scores. Let your body condition scores tell you how your nutrition program is going. So thinking about where we want to keep our cows. So we really want to keep our cows in that 5 to 6 body condition score. So really that middle of the road, we don't want them too thin. We can start seeing a drop off and reproductive efficiency as we get down into 4 and lower. We can really see cows that are obese, and that's 7, 8 up to 9. Those cows are also going to be ones that we don't see maximum reproductive efficiency in. So really keeping the middle of the road, that 5 to 6 body condition scores is great. So vaccines. So as we move into vaccines, we can really think about 2 types that we have most commonly. We have modified live. So our young stock need modified live vaccines. Those are going to be the best at creating a robust immune system. Killed vaccines have a place. Usually in our adult cow herd is where we use a lot of killed vaccines, especially if we're vaccinating pregnant cows. Killed vaccines are probably what we're going to use most of the time if we're vaccinating pregnant cows. We can use modified live vaccines in the cows if they have seen that vaccine within the last year. Young stock modified live vaccines, usually our adult cows are killed. So thinking about those. So we could talk all day about vaccines once again, but just trying to hit the highlights and give you some food for thought. We can also see other types of vaccines. So we can see mucosal modified live. These are our intranasals. Intranasals are becoming increasingly more popular to use in our young calves at branding time, that 2 to 3 month old, when we're giving calves their initial vaccines. We can see some autogenous vaccines on the market as well. Ones that are most commonly used, we can see autogenous vaccines for pink eye and things of that nature. They do require a valid client-patient relationship. So if you are having a disease outbreak, your veterinarian may suggest building an autogenous vaccine. And this is where another place that your VCPR will come in. So vaccine recommendations. Remember that it's a cold supply chain and that your vaccines need to stay cool. If you don't have a vaccine box, there are plans online to make homemade vaccine boxes. So this is just a picture that I pulled off the internet of a homemade one. You can buy commercially available ones. So just make sure that we keep our vaccines cool. We don't want to shake our vaccines. If we need to mix a vaccine, we want to go back and forth and gently rock those. Don't use expired vaccines. They probably have lost their efficacy and not going to do a great job. And remember to report adverse reactions. Drug companies love to know when there is a problem. So thinking about that and how that affects your cattle herd, and your vaccine companies and your veterinarians want to know when there is an adverse reaction. So did you have an anaphylactic reaction or something else in your animals that you vaccinated? And then we want to take care with your endotoxic loading. So we don't want to make sure that we don't give more than 2 gram-negative vaccines at a time. So an example of this would, we don't want to give a pink eye vaccine and a foot rot vaccine at the same time. And so your veterinarian will work with you to make sure that these are taken care of and that you don't, but just some nice reminders. So common pathogens that we vaccinate for. So Clostridiums are common, right? This is where our tetanus and blackleg come in. Respiratory, we know our IBRs, our BVDs. We can, depending on the conditions, vaccinate for Mannheimia or Pasteurella. Reproductive vaccines that we commonly use, Campylobacter, also known as Vibrio, Lepto in our cows, BVD and IBR both have reproductive. Brucellosis, we may vaccinate our heifer calves for brucellosis, and then trichomoniasis if you have either a high risk herd, or if you have a herd that trich has been diagnosed in. Other vaccines that we can see, scour vaccines, pink eye vaccines, foot rot, and then occasionally rabies. So typical vaccine program in cow-calf operations, heifers are going to get vaccinated pre-breeding. We're going to use our modified live vaccines. We're going to use Clostridial with tetanus, plus or minus pink eye, depending on your area and the prevalence in your herd. Cows pre-calving are going to get a killed vaccine. Always booster your Clostridial. It's cheap, it's easy. Depending on your herd, you may or may not use a scour vaccine. And then calves prior to weaning, you're going to get a modified live and really focusing on respiratory. We're going to booster, if I hit the wrong button, we're going to booster our Clostridial vaccine if they haven't previously gotten one. And then we need to make sure that we revaccinate if that's the first one. So making sure that we booster appropriately. So I would be remiss before I hand it over to Dr. Gibbons. Remember about your beef cattle temperature humidity chart. We are not really right now getting out of our danger emergency areas on this chart right now. So think about that when you are thinking about pre-weaning or weaning cattle right now, or you're handling cattle at all. So great reminder. So I will hand it over to Dr. Gibbons.
All right. So I'm going to start with parasite control. Next slide.
Oops, sorry.
Okay. So when we talk about parasite control, we're really going to think about three groups. We've got our ectoparasites, of which flies are our most important, but also lice and mites. They're mainly winter problems. And then we have our endoparasites, which are our mostly stomach parasites. And obviously, I know that you guys joining us today are from across the region. And so some of you, if you're down on the Gulf Coast area, anywhere sort of in Texas, south of College Station, you're going to run into liver flukes. So just like other things when we talk about our herd health plan, it's really specific to your area. And then in young stock, we want to think about coccidia. So we don't typically think of coccidia as a problem in our adult cows. Next. So flies are probably the biggest issue. Obviously, flies spread diseases. We're going to think about pink eye and anaplasma as our most important diseases that they spread, but also fly worrying, weight loss, and average daily gain. So control of our flies are really important. And I'm going to kind of go a little fast through this in the interest of time, so we kind of get all of our areas covered. But the one thing to think about is that we do have resistance to insecticides reported. And so it's not as easy as just spraying everything with permethrin these days. There's lots more components to controlling flies. We do want to think about what flies we have, and the different type of flies typically live in different parts of the body. And so we've got to think about these as different targets. Next. So there's, as I said before, there's lots of methods of fly control, and what you do on your ranch is very dependent on how you can work your cattle, what the environment is, and what the fly level is as well. And most people will end up using multiple fly control methods. So we have fly tags. Really key thing, I like fly tags, but you have to remove them at the end of the season because otherwise they'll have residual effect and cause resistance. You want to wait until there's about 200 flies per animal. Otherwise, you're going to start them too early in the season and they're not going to last. And you're going to want to rotate because they're the biggest risk of causing resistance. We have oilers and dust bags. We have sprays. Biological fly control is becoming really popular. And then the insect growth regulators in feed as well. So it's a good opportunity to talk to your veterinarian about what works best for your ranch. Next. So endoparasites, we used to think that we could just deworm on a routine. And if any of you are familiar with small ruminants and sheep and goats, you know that we have a lot of resistance issues. And we thought we were really lucky in the cattle industry, we didn't have that. We now know that we have resistance to our anthelmintics or our dewormer drugs. And there's a couple of different parasites that we have to think about. Osteichthyes is kind of the most common one, causes weight loss, diarrhea, typically in the cooler season. We can also have Cuperia in young cattle. And all of these parasites live on grass. And their life cycle moves as the larvae grow up the grass. So they have to be eating grass to come into contact with this, which most of our cow-calf herd is. The other one you want to be aware of is the barber pole worm, which is typically a small ruminant one, but it will affect stockers. And we're seeing more and more of this as our climate changes. Next. Excuse me. So the principles of treatment of stomach worms, and it's really hard to make any recommendations because it's different for every place. But in your herd plan, your veterinarian should discuss what diagnostics are we going to do. So we do a lot more fecal egg counts in cattle than we used to do. What treatment is effective, and how are we going to maintain refugia? And I'm going to talk about refugia in a second. And so how overall are we going to manage this? So stomach worms have become this really encompassing, multifaceted method of control. Next. So refugia is really what we're wanting to maintain. So basically, the concept of refugia is that we're always going to have some parasites that are resistant to the dewormers because they're smarter than we are. So we want to always have some worms that are not exposed to the dewormer. And so those worms are either living on the pasture or they are in cattle that we don't treat. So I can tell you that in a drought situation like this year, where it's very, very dry, there's going to be very little parasites live on the pasture. They're going to be all in the stomachs of the cattle. And so if we treat all of our cattle with dewormers, then we're going to have nothing in refugia. The other thing we want to think about is fecal egg counts. We want to count those, and then we can tell if our dewormers are working or not. So if you think that you have a parasite resistance issues, fecal egg counts is the way to go. The other thing to think about is, I know long range is really nice, but it is really contraindicated. So do not use it on cow-calf herds on permanent pasture, because it does speed up the development of resistance. Next. Coccidia control, again, for young stock, but probably more of a problem if you are backgrounding your own cattle. So it is in young stock. We've got diarrhea, weight loss, straining to defecate. So if you're seeing a lot of rectal prolapse, we often think that that's a coccidia problem. We can control it with in-feed medications, in-water medications. So if you are backgrounding your own cattle or finishing them out, then incorporating coccidia into your herd health plan is going to be key. Next. Liver flukes. We have two types of liver flukes. We have Fascioloides magna, which is the deer flukes. We can have issues because it will damage the liver and cause clostridial disease. And Fasciola hepatica, which is the traditional liver fluke, and it can cause weight loss, death, anemia. We have very limited treatments for these, and some of them aren't always available, like Ivermectin Plus and Valbazen, which is an oral drench. So that's a little more challenging when you work cattle to do that. So if you are in an area where liver flukes have been identified, and if you don't know that, your veterinarian will know that, your extension agent or TVMDL, which is the diagnostic lab, has a pretty good idea as to where they've seen cattle and diagnosed liver fluke. So you want to think about how we're going to prevent it and what our treatment will be. Next. Some of you may or may not heard of this. So this is an emerging disease, Theileria orientalis. It's spread by the Asian longhorn tick, and it causes clinical signs similar to anaplasma, but treatment is much, much harder. And younger cattle can be affected as well. So this is something that we are becoming more and more aware of. It is spreading west. So the things that we want to think about is tick control with when we're talking about our fly control, thinking about protecting against ticks. And if you are buying cattle out of the Southeast, making sure that they are checked for ticks before you bring them in. Next. Anaplasma, most of Texas is endemic for anaplasma, so most of our cattle will have immunity to it. It's going to be more of a problem if you sell cattle out of state. And so the other thing we want to think about is biosecurity. This is a disease that we can control by biosecurity. So the way we work cattle, it's spread by blood. So flies can spread it, so fly control. It's spread by ticks, tick control. It's also spread by needles. So we want, if you have anaplasma in your herd, and you can do a diagnostic test for it as well. So if you don't know, you can find out if you're interested in that. But you want to not use the same needle on every cow. So it does slow down processing just a touch, just to change needles between each cow, but it will significantly cut down the risk of disease spread. Same as when you're palpating cows, you want to, or the bet is, we routinely change sleeves between each cows. So there are treatment of it, and there is control with in-feed antibiotics. They do require a VFD. Yeah, next. So biosecurity, next. So what is biosecurity? So we want to prevent diseases from entering. So if you are starting off and you haven't purchased cattle yet, this is a really long list, so not to scare you, but it just means that you should be aware of some of these things. Some of the major diseases of concerns is BVD, which is bovine viral diarrhea virus, which actually we see little diarrhea from, but it can cause a whole host of different things, from really sick young cattle susceptible to pneumonia, to abortion, to malformed calves. And it's spread by buying in what's called a PI, or persistently infected younger animal. And so that's a very easy screening disease we can screen against with a pretty reliable test. So that's a really good common thing to test for. Johne's disease. Johne's disease is a disease that causes weight loss and diarrhea in adult cattle. However, the challenge is that it's pretty hard to test for unless the animal is actually sick with the disease. And then we can have a lot of subclinical cattle. So we want to make sure that if we're buying cattle, we want to keep Johne's disease out, whether we have some good records from those incoming animals. Dr. Kojal talked already a little bit about trick. And obviously if we're buying in bulls, they should be trick negative before they are sold. I already talked about anaplasm and how to keep those animals out. Foot rot is another one. If you are in a very wet area or it's a wet year, foot rot is spreadable. So we want to make sure that we buy sound cattle. If they're lame, we don't want to put them into our herd. BLV is bovine leukosis virus. It's a disease that can cause leukemia and cancer. It's pretty prevalent in the dairy industry and sporadically in the beef industry. It's most of a problem in the dairy industry, but if you're doing a screening test, it is a disease that you can screen for in a blood test. Again, liver flukes, know where you're buying your cattle from as to whether they've had liver flukes before. Obviously, if you're buying them from an endemic area and you're taking them to the panhandle, the flukes probably aren't going to survive up here. So resistant parasites, the same thing. Know where you're buying your cattle from and how they're managing the cattle. And then the Neospora is a disease that causes abortion. Again, more of an issue in the dairy industry, but we will find it in beef cattle as well. Big thing with Neospora is you don't really want to buy pregnant cattle that could abort. Next. So when you're working with your herd veterinarian to build your biosecurity plans, that veterinarian is going to know what your operation is. And you can separate them into closed herds and open herds. So as we are building a cattle herd, we're probably going to be an open herd. So we're going to be bringing in a lot of cattle unless you want to start really small and breed your own. Depends how fast you want to expand. So if you have an open herd and you're wanting to ultimately end up in a closed herd where you don't bring external animals in and the only thing you bring in is new genetics from a bull, then you really want to be very specific as to the disease status of those animals. If you have a closed herd already, we want to keep those diseases out. So we want to know what we have, what is in our management system that we can manage, and what our risk is from whether we're going to be expanding our herd and buying in new cattle. We want to think about how those diseases are spread. So whether they're oral, whether they're aerosol, direct contact, reproductive, vectors, fomites, which is diseases that travel on things, and then vehicles as well. So you can have a very basic biosecurity plan all the way up to a very strict closed herd where you limit visitors and disinfect and all that. So there's certainly a range of on the spectrum of biosecurity. Next. So these are some of the management practices. So a lot of this can be covered by the BQA. So I'm not going to go into cattle handling. So the BQA program will cover cattle handling. But castration, dehorning, tagging, implanting, and branding are all things that could be described as to the way that it is done in your herd. And this has two purposes. One, to make sure that you communicate with your veterinarian and they can make the best recommendations for welfare of the animals. And welfare is important because it decreases stress, which decreases disease. So it's important for us to make the most welfare-friendly way of doing these procedures. And also as a training tool. So if you have employees, if you have a manual or a herd plan, you can clearly show them that this is the way we do things on this operation. Next. So castrating and dehorning, we want to castrate them as young as possible. The older they get, the more attached to them they get. The younger we do it, the less stress is on the animal, the more welfare friendly it is. Ideally, we do it at a time as the same vaccination and before they're about 200 pounds. And it depends on your operation. You might band calves at 24 hours old. You might wait until the vaccination. It depends on your handling facilities, the number of cattle, labor, and it's all very ranch specific. Next. So there's lots of different ways to castrate. We have banding, we have surgical. We do follow the AABP guidelines. AABP guidelines does recommend a local anesthetic and a non-steroidal, so an anti-inflammatory. And to talk to your veterinarian, they can prescribe those drugs for you. They can come out and do it depending on your comfort level. Next. Dehorning, obviously, probably some of you will need to dehorn. Again, different ways of doing it. Disbudding hot iron and caustic paste on baby calves. Probably not as labor friendly in a beef herd. So most of them will be dehorned a little larger using a Barnes dehorner. Again, dehorning guidelines recommend using local anesthetic and a non-steroidal. Again, if we do those, we're going to have less setback and improve average daily gain. Next. Implanting, if there are options to implant, even if you don't background, there are options to implant for the grazing calf. And potentially for the replacement heifer, but most recommendations are not to do that. There are some key things with implanting. You want to make sure that you have a clean ear because you can cause abscesses when you implant. And you want to make sure that the implant success. So certainly in the feed yard, that's something that people do where they come back through and make sure that those implants are actually staying in. And each implant gun, so each company has their own gun and it tells you exactly how to do that, but you are going to do it on the back of the ear between the ribs, just underneath the skin. Next. Tagging, again, recommend tags. We have brucellosis tags if you're going to vaccinate your heifers, which in Texas will be between 4 and 12 months of age only. Most places now are switching to the RFID tags, much easier going through sale bonds. Even if you elect not to do a traceable tag, management tags are really key. You can put a lot of information on there, and for record keeping, that's really important. It's hard to keep good records if you don't know who that cow is. And even if you know their names, and if the veterinarian doesn't know their name, so it's much easier to say cow 84 is open, and then we can have a really good record of that animal. And again, really good records means that we can see where we're falling behind on our benchmarking, and we can really early on implement changes. So it's not, you're not going to have a loss of production. Next. The one thing I do want to mention, we are in the state of Texas where we do have lots of natural disasters. There is a natural disaster preparedness plan for beef herds, and there is the foot and mouth secure beef preparedness too. So we have two things that you should think about and could be in your herd plan that your veterinarian helps you write. You want to know what your risks are. So obviously if you're on the coast, then hurricanes are going to be far more likely, and flooding. If you're somewhere else, winter storms might be more. So it's all about a risk. What's the likelihood and what's the impact? Things that you want to think about are insurance, making sure you have the animal ID. So if fences are cut in a wildfire, you can identify your cattle. Set up those local lines of communication. So if you're new in the area, who can help you truck? Where can you get feed supplies? Who has portable handling facilities to help you round up your cattle? You want to know whether there's any chemicals on your property, especially in flood zones, because then there's a risk of toxicity to the cattle. But then we also want to make sure that you're prepared too, because your family is important and comes first. If you have records, take them with you and make sure they're backed up. And again, another reason in a disaster to have vaccinated cattle is that they're going to be mixed potentially at the sale barn if that's the place where they're being evacuated to. And then have a supply or know where you can get a supply of emergency feed and water. Next. So this is the secure beef supply. It's a continuity of business plan for cattle operations should foot and mouth hit us, which unfortunately is probably always at risk the way that the world is going. So if you do, you can sign up for this. You will get a premises identification number, and they will help you do an enhanced biosecurity plan. And it's all just in case, and we all hope that this disease does not actually come to the US. Next. So as we kind of wrap up here, there are some other things that you could find on the herd plan. I'm not going to go into great detail. One of the things is euthanasia. So if you don't have a veterinarian that's super close on emergency and you have a cow that needs to be euthanized, you can have training on how to euthanize them. And then also carcass disposal. How are you going to dispose of that carcass? Depending on location, it's all county, city dependent. How are you going to manage cows that are down? Typically more of a dairy problem, but we do get down beef cows, and welfare ensures that we should handle them appropriately. It's great if your veterinarian can develop a medication list and a withdrawal time. So if you do have to treat an animal with drug X, you can easily go to your herd plan and see, oh, this drug X has a 28-day withdrawal time. So I need to know that I can't ship that cow for 28 days. Mentioned it earlier, but if we are employing people, we can also keep a log as who's been trained. Which of your employees has BQA training? Which of them have you actually communicated your castration and dehorning procedures to? And then we can also think about antimicrobial sustainability and have which drugs are we going to use and which types of drugs are we going to minimize. Next. And I think we're pretty much out of time. Is that correct? So the only other thing I was going to cover was just as an example of what a disease protocol would be. So a disease protocol would be that you would be able to, the vet would write down exactly what a disease is, what it looks like, what to do, and when to call them if it didn't improve or if it looked abnormal. So we'll take any questions if we have time.
If you have any questions, you're welcome to submit them in the Q&A and we will get those answered. I'll also drop my email, and if you have questions after this or need anything, you can get in contact with me, and I will see if y'all send me the slides. I can get them to people if you want the slides. Perfect. Well, I'll give it about another minute to see if there's any questions.
There's one here about if you have a open bottle of killed vaccine. That's a really good question. My recommendations is to follow what the manufacturer says, and that is for the reason that it should be fine, but should there be contamination, and if you were to use it and there was an issue, then the drug company will not help you out, essentially. If you follow the recommendations and you have a reaction, then there are protocols that your veterinarian will go through with the drug company. But if you don't, it's try and buy the smallest bottle available is kind of my recommendation for that, especially for smaller herds.
There's another question. If your vet is old school and you don't quite agree with their current practices, what should you do? Lots of different ways you can handle that. You can look to start another veterinary client relationship with another veterinarian. You can open the table, come to the table with suggestions and discussions. I am of the school of thought that it should be a two-way conversation. And so each person gets to choose how they handle that with their operation, but those are some suggestions. Anything else, Pippa?
That's kind of what I was going to say. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you both for your time. That was very informative. I know I personally really enjoyed that, and we look forward to connecting with y'all down the road. And if any attendees have questions, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get you in contact with them.
Sounds good. We'll send those slides over after we get off of here.
Okay, perfect. Thank y'all. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.